I always thought those haunted house stories were nonsense, but lately, I've started questioning everything. I have 2 small kids, and I've always been careful about their safety. A few weeks ago, strange things began happening in their room. Toys that should have been put away appeared in the middle of the room, or worse, turned on by themselves at night. The first time I heard the sound of the firefighter truck with dead batteries, I was freaked out, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a defect. But as these incidents kept happening more frequently, I decided to install a camera in their room to see what was going on. For the first few days, I didn't see anything unusual, which gave me some relief. But in one of the recordings, I noticed a shadow by my baby's crib. It looked like a figure standing still, just watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of reflection, or maybe I was just too tired and seeing things. But as the days went by, this same silhouette appeared in the recordings, always in the same spot, standing next to the crib. I watched this with my heart racing, trying to understand who or what was in that room. Things started getting worse when I noticed it wasn't just shadows on the camera. Handprints began appearing on the furniture, and especially on the edges of the crib. These prints were strange, a kind of grayish color, like someone had run their hand over it with something odd. Something that didn't come off with regular cleaning. And even after scrubbing, they'd reappear in the same spot. I started to feel constantly watched, especially when I was alone with the kids. The presence seemed to hang in the air, heavy, like it was challenging me to do something about it. One night, I was so exhausted that I skipped checking the camera before bed. The next morning, I decided to review the footage, and what I saw was even more disturbing. The shadowy figure wasn't just standing by the crib. It seemed to be leaning closer to my baby, as if it was observing every detail. And this time, there was a faint, muffled sound, almost like heavy breathing. There was no face, but the idea that something, or someone, was so close to my children while they slept put me in a state of panic. After that episode, I started reviewing the recordings every morning, even though I dreaded what I might find. One night was particularly terrifying. The camera showed the silhouette moving slowly, almost as if it were exploring the room. At one point, it stopped by my older daughter's bed, staying there for a few minutes before returning to my baby's crib. The worst part was the feeling that it wasn't just standing there. It seemed to be watching every detail, as if waiting for something. Each time I watched, the anxiety grew, and I didn't know what else to do to protect my kids. I started to notice that, besides the handprints, the children's bedding was always messed up in the morning, as if someone had been touching it. Some nights, I'd hear a faint scratching on the wall or muffled noises, almost like whispers coming from their room. Every night, my fear grew, but I couldn't just turn off the camera. Part of me wanted to understand what was happening, as if I needed to confront it head-on, but another part of me didn't want to see anything that might make it worse. One night, the camera began to glitch just as I was watching the live feed. The image became distorted, and I could only catch flashes of the silhouette standing by the crib, as if it were even closer to my baby. I tried to convince myself it was just a connection issue, but the feeling that this thing was becoming more present, more real, was undeniable. When the image returned to normal, the silhouette had disappeared, but the crib sheets were slightly wrinkled, like someone had pressed their hands on them, leaving physical proof of their presence. The next day, my husband tried to convince me that I was becoming obsessed with these recordings, and that maybe it was just shadows from the furniture or lighting effects. I wanted to believe him, but something told me it was more than that. Each mark, each detail made me more convinced that this wasn't a coincidence. Our home, which used to be our safe haven, started to feel like a strange place, as if another presence was there, always watching, always lurking. In the last recording I watched, the camera captured something I'll never be able to forget. In the middle of the night, the silhouette appeared again, but this time it was bent over the crib, almost as if it was touching my baby. My whole body went cold watching that. When the figure stepped back, I could clearly see handprints again on the edges of the crib, even more distinct, as if they were left as a warning. It was too much for me. At that moment, I realized I couldn't bear to keep watching those recordings. I decided to remove the camera from the room and stop recording the nights. Since then, the noises have lessened, and the marks appear less frequently, but the feeling that something remains in the house still haunts me. Sometimes, even when I don't want to, I feel like I'm being watched, especially at night when I pass by the kids' room. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know that it wasn't my imagination. This constant fear is something that has never left me. I've been working as a night shift attendant in a hospital for a few years, and anyone who works the night shift knows there's this strange energy in the air. It's like the night drags out people's secrets and regrets. The elderly patients, especially, seem to have this urgency to talk, as if they need to unload something before their time runs out. I listen to each story respectfully, understanding that it might be their last chance to feel some relief. I never thought any of these stories would stick with me, but last week, one confession in particular left me with chills. It was an older man, visibly exhausted, with a look that seemed both distant and incredibly alert at the same time. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and started talking in a low voice, almost as if he was confessing, but with a certain pressure that was impossible to ignore. He admitted he'd caused an accident years ago on a deserted road. He described, in disturbing detail, how he'd left someone there, begging for help, and simply drove away. His voice trembled, but his expression was hollow, as if he was reliving every moment with each word. I felt a chill, and even after he finished speaking, that image stuck with me. After that night, I couldn't shake the scene from my mind. I'd heard stories of regret before, but nothing like this. It was as if he wasn't remorseful for what he did, but for what it had brought into his life afterward. He mentioned not being able to sleep peacefully and seeing things no one should see. When I asked what he meant by that, he just looked away, unwilling to give more details. Still, those few words were enough to put me on edge. Deep down, part of me wanted to brush it off and stick to my routine, but something about it wouldn't let me. In the nights that followed, I noticed his behavior started changing. He would look toward the corner of the room or out into the hallway, as if he was waiting for someone to appear. Out of curiosity, I checked the security cameras, mostly to prove to myself it was just paranoia, but that's when things started getting strange. In one of the recordings, I saw a blurred figure standing at his door. It was just a silhouette, no features, but it seemed to be staring directly at his bed. There was nobody there in real life, only on the camera. I checked the timestamp and noticed it happened around 3 a.m., always when the hospital was at its quietest. At first, I thought it might be a glitch in the cameras or some interference, so I tried to ignore it. But every night I checked, that figure was there, standing in the same spot, looking toward the old man's room. Each time it appeared, I felt a growing unease, a tightness in my chest. I started getting nervous just walking down his hallway, and even the other staff noticed I was acting differently. I mentioned the footage to a coworker, but he just laughed and said it was all in my head, typical of someone working late hours. I tried to laugh it off too, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. One of those nights, I decided to dig a little deeper into the patient's past. I managed to access some basic information in the system, and I found out he'd been a suspect in a hit-and-run case, but there was never enough evidence to convict him. The victim, the one he described in his confession, was never found, and the case had faded away over the years as an unsolved mystery. Realizing the gravity of what he'd done sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just some random confession. He'd actually done it and had carried this secret for decades. That night, the atmosphere felt even heavier. The old man seemed especially agitated, muttering things I couldn't quite make out. I tried to avoid looking at him, but it was like he knew I was suspicious, because every time I passed his room, I could feel his eyes on me, even when they were almost closed. At one point, he called me over again, and with a trembling voice he said, "He's still out there, waiting for me, that sent a shiver down my spine. It was like he knew that the figure on the cameras was really there for him. I decided I needed to see that footage live, so I left the monitoring screen open on my phone to keep an eye on it. When 3 a.m. hit, the figure appeared at his doorway, clearer than ever. Now, I could see something truly unsettling. It looked like the figure was gradually moving closer to his bed. It was as if, each night, it was taking one more step into his room. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. At that moment, I felt an almost irrational urge to go to his room and face whatever was happening, even though I was terrified. I walked down the hallway, each step heavy, with the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and echoing off the hospital's empty walls. When I reached his door, I took a deep breath before opening it. The old man was awake, but his eyes were fixed on a specific spot on the wall, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. I asked him if he was okay, but he just shook his head slowly, his face full of pure terror. Then, I felt a sudden chill pass through the room, the kind of cold that makes your bones shake. I looked at the monitor on my phone and saw that the figure was now right beside his bed. I looked back at the old man, who started mumbling something I couldn't understand, his hands visibly trembling. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run out of there, but another part felt like I had to stay. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the old man turned his face toward me and whispered. He finally came for me. The fear in his face was so real that it made my throat tighten. At that moment, the figure on the screen vanished. I looked around, trying to rationalize, but the air felt thick and heavy, loaded with an invisible tension. I could sense something was there, but I couldn't see it. The old man closed his eyes and let out a long, drawn-out sigh, as if relieved or resigned. The heart monitor began to beep, and his vitals weakened until he passed away. I stood by his bed, frozen, still in shock. Even after all my years working in the hospital, I'd never experienced anything so strange. In that moment, I had the sense that, somehow, he had finally found whatever he'd been waiting for. I thought it would all end with his passing, but the next night, while making my rounds, I had the curiosity to check the cameras one last time, hoping to convince myself that the figure was gone. But when I looked at the monitor, I felt a deep chill. The figure was back, standing in the same place, in the hallway where I walked every night. And this time, it seemed to be looking straight at the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I turned off the monitor immediately and tried to finish my shift, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me until dawn. Since then, I've seen that shadow on other cameras, in random parts of the hospital, almost like it's roaming, waiting for someone else. I don't know if it came for him or if it's here for me now, but every night, around 3 a.m., I feel that same cold I felt in his room, like that presence never really left. And to this day, I've never been able to shake what I saw on that monitor. When my father died and my mother simply vanished, I was really young. I don't think I understood what was happening at the time. I just felt this huge emptiness. That's when they appeared, Grant, Shirley, and Albert. I had no idea where they'd come from. I just knew they were always there, and for some reason, it made me feel less alone, like I was never really by myself. Grant and Shirley were like real friends, the kind who were there to help you. Grant always tried to make me laugh, and Shirley had this calm way about her, like she knew how to ease what I was feeling. But Albert was different. From the start, he gave me chills. There was nothing friendly about him. He looked at me like he knew me deeply, but in a way nobody wants to be known. I talked about them to my aunt, who took care of me after my parents were gone. At first, she thought it was just a way for me to cope with the trauma, which wasn't wrong. But over time, I began to notice she got uncomfortable whenever I mentioned Albert. I tried to explain that Grant and Shirley made me feel better, but Albert, he was like a shadow that only brought fear. It wasn't just his appearance, pale, with a fixed stare and a serious expression. It was the feeling he gave me. Whenever I saw him, it felt like the air around me froze and my body would lock up. He never said anything. He just stared at me. When I started therapy as a teenager, the idea was to help me understand what I'd been through and also to get rid of these figures, which, according to the therapist, weren't healthy. It was strange because, little by little, Grant and Shirley disappeared. I missed them, like I'd lost real friends. The most disturbing part was that, despite the sessions and everything, Albert didn't go away. He only seemed more present, like he became more solid as the others vanished. It was as if he knew that with Grant and Shirley out of the picture, he had more space to manifest. And his presence grew more intense, more real, challenging any sense of logic. The first time I realized how Albert was becoming something beyond an imaginary friend was during a dinner with my girlfriend. We were at a restaurant, and in the middle of the conversation, I felt that familiar chill that always came with him. I looked around, and there was Albert, standing a few meters away, staring at me with that empty, disturbing look. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. My girlfriend noticed something was wrong and asked me what was up. I didn't know how to explain that an imaginary friend from childhood, who should have disappeared years ago, was right there, watching me. After that dinner, Albert started showing up with a terrifying frequency, like he wanted to remind me that he was never going to leave. I saw him everywhere. On the street, leaving work, even reflected in the windows of my own home. He was a constant presence, impossible to ignore. The feeling he brought wasn't just fear. It was a real threat. And the most disturbing thing was that he seemed increasingly able to interact with the environment around me. Once, I saw the doorknob of my bedroom slowly turning, and when I opened the door, there he was, standing there with that empty stare. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do, and I just slammed the door shut, as if that would somehow keep me safe. My life turned into a complete nightmare. Every corner of my house felt like it was under Albert's control, as if he could show up at any moment. I started avoiding being alone, which was practically impossible. Even when my girlfriend spent the night with me, I felt Albert was there, watching, coming closer and closer. One night, I woke up and, looking at the bedroom door, saw him standing there, like he was waiting for something. I shut my eyes, trembling, trying to convince myself he'd disappear if I ignored him. But the weight of his presence was too real. It felt like he was closer than ever, about to cross a line I couldn't stop him from crossing. After days of living in constant tension, I tried everything to get rid of Albert. I went back to therapy, explained everything to the therapist, even the recent appearances, but she thought it was just the trauma resurfacing, a manifestation of unresolved issues from my past. I knew it wasn't that. Albert was something else, something that defied any rational explanation. I also decided to tell a few friends, but most of them just looked at me with pity, like I was losing my mind. More isolated and with no one who believed me, I started thinking maybe it was better to let it go and try to live normally, even if Albert kept appearing around every corner. But it's impossible to ignore something that hunts you so relentlessly. One night, after getting home from a long day at work, I noticed my bedroom window was open. I knew I'd closed it before leaving. My heart started pounding, and the first thing that came to mind was Albert. I walked in slowly, trying not to make any noise, and then I saw him sitting in the corner chair, staring at me. There was no longer any doubt he could interact with the real world. I stood frozen at the door, unable to move, while he continued to watch me with that empty, threatening stare. That was when I realized Albert was never going away. He was here to stay, and I had lost any control over it. Aqui esteo os quatro paragrafos fines traduzidos para o inglés. The last time I saw Albert was on what turned out to be the most terrifying night of my life. I was at home, completely alone, already used to avoiding any public places or meeting up with friends. That night, I felt his presence stronger than ever, like he was in every room at the same time. When I walked into the living room, there he was, no longer a distant shadow, but close enough that I could almost feel his cold breath. He didn't move, just kept staring at me. But this time, his eyes had something different, a strange glint, almost like satisfaction. The fear I felt was so intense that my body froze. I just stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the worst. Then, he simply disappeared, like he had never been there at all. I stood still, not knowing what to think or do, my mind trying to process what had just happened. And the worst part is, even now, I have no answers. Albert hasn't shown up since that night, but the fear of him remains with me, as if he could come back at any moment. Sometimes, I still feel that familiar chill, that sensation of being watched, and I wonder if he really left, or if he's just waiting to appear again. It feels like he left an invisible mark on me, something that will never let me find peace. Even today, whenever I sense a presence around me, my first thought is, Albert is back. When I accepted the job as Mrs. Martha's caretaker, I thought it would be easy. She was an old lady in her early 80s, with that fragile look and slow walk you'd expect from someone her age. Her house was one of those old constructions, with that smell of aged wood and an eerie silence, like the place itself was stuck in another time. Right off the bat, I noticed she had some peculiar habits. Every afternoon, before nightfall, she'd insist on opening one of the windows in the living room and would stand there, staring at the garden as if she were expecting someone. Once, I asked if she was waiting for a visitor, and she just mumbled something like, "They're always around," and quickly changed the subject. The first few nights were quiet, but the way she'd talk to what seemed like nothing was already getting to me. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just one of those things elderly people do when they start to lose touch with reality. But then, one of those nights, I started hearing whispers coming from outside the house. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But the whispers almost sounded like words, like someone was actually out there, speaking softly, right up against the windows. When I went to check, I saw no one, but that chill down my spine didn't leave. As the days went by, those whispers outside became more frequent. Every night, when the house was completely silent, there they were again. Only now, it seemed like they were coming from different spots around the house, as if someone were walking outside, whispering at each window. And Mrs. Martha, she didn't seem to mind at all. Or, if anything, she seemed to enjoy it. One night, I woke up and went to check on her. It was part of my job, and saw that her bedroom door was open. When I looked inside, her bed was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe she had gone to the bathroom, but after checking, I couldn't find her anywhere in the house. I walked around the house, trying not to panic. It was an old place, full of doors and rooms, but honestly, my heart was racing. I started hearing light, slow footsteps coming from somewhere nearby, but every time I got to the room where I thought the sound was coming from, it was empty. It wasn't until I reached the living room that I saw her. Mrs. Martha was standing in the dark, right in front of the main door, staring intently at the wood as if there was something or someone on the other side. That scene left me frozen for a few seconds. It was way too strange to see someone as frail as her, completely still, with that fixed stare. I approached her slowly, trying not to make a sound, and softly called her name. She didn't respond, didn't even seem to notice I was there. I stood there, trying to decide if I should take her back to her room, or let her do whatever she was doing. But then, without even looking away from the door, she whispered something. I couldn't quite catch what it was, but I could tell it wasn't anything good. It sounded more like a warning, something she was saying with a sense of fear. I was about to reach out and touch her shoulder when a sound from outside broke the silence. It was like someone scratching their nails on the wooden door, a dry, dragging noise. Instinctively, I took a step back, while Mrs. Martha remained completely still, like she was in a trance. The only thought in my head was that I needed to get out of there. I started backing away, slowly, trying not to make any noise. But when I reached the hallway, she took a step toward me. I stood there, waiting for her to say something, but the silence was suffocating. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I turned and headed back to my room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep after all that. I locked the door and sat on my bed, heart racing and breathing heavy, trying to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't tell if I was dealing with some mental health issue of hers, or if there was really something strange going on in that house. Either way, I knew I couldn't just ignore the whispers and that bizarre expression she had shown that night. After a while, I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling, listening to every little sound. Then, I heard footsteps again, but this time, they were closer. They seemed to be coming from the hallway, stopping right outside my door. I curled up, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, and then, as if someone had changed their mind, the footsteps started moving away. Just when I thought the worst was over, I heard something unexpected. Mrs. Martha's voice, murmuring from the other side of the door. She was speaking in such a low tone that I could barely make out the words, as if she were whispering to someone right there in the hallway. My curiosity and fear were in a brutal tug of war. I got up from the bed, walked to the door, and pressed my ear against it, trying to catch what she was saying. Her words were disjointed, but one thing stood out. She seemed to be talking to them, whoever they were. The feeling that there was someone else in that house, an invisible presence, was almost tangible. Suddenly, everything went silent again, and I pulled my ear away from the door, my heart pounding like crazy. I decided I couldn't just stay locked up in my room. I had to see what was happening. When I opened the door slowly, the hallway was empty, but the main door, the one she had been staring at in the living room, was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact that I had locked all the doors before going to bed. I walked over there with a growing sense of dread, and when I reached the door, I looked outside and saw nothing but darkness, as if something or someone had just left. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the night, half expecting something to come into view. My instincts were screaming for me to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot, like I was under some strange spell. Finally, I forced myself to close the door and lock it again, my hands shaking the entire time. The house felt colder, heavier, like whatever presence had been there was still lingering. I went back to my room, barely slept, and left as soon as the first light appeared. To this day, I still can't explain what happened that night. I never went back to work for Mrs. Martha, and every time I think about her, standing there in the dark, talking to something or someone unseen, I get chills. It's been months, but those whispers still haunt me.